used to work in an all-male burlesque house in California, and that's why he's got this kind of style. He's not just an amateur. Mike Ross is a good friend of mine and Tony Costello. We went to school together. Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me? Yes? And we haven't seen him for many years, and he looks exactly the same. He has different glasses frames, but other than that, he looks exactly the same as he did several years ago, and it makes us very happy to have him here in Muncie. Even though now we're really mature and somewhat accomplished, we used to be really wild and crazy, and we try to clean this up in the past few years so we could make ourselves more respectable. I should only talk for myself. Mike is a graduate of Cornell University and of Columbia University, where Tony and I met him, and he studied at the University of Hawaii, where he studied Japanese and Japanese art and architecture. And first and foremost, I should point out that Mike is an architect who has an interest in Japan and Japanese architecture. He's not a historian, and his interest through a Fulbright scholarship enabled him to make a trip to Japan and a couple more trips following that. And in addition to his Fulbright scholarship, he received many other awards, including traveling fellowships from Cornell University. And of note here in Indiana is the fact that he was the project architect for the Columbus Occupational Health Center that Hardy Holtzman and Pfeiffer received an award for in Columbus, Indiana. And right now, he is the he's the director of architectural programs for Daniel Mann Johnson Mendenhall in Los Angeles. And the firm of Daniel Mann Johnson Mendenhall has how many offices? More than one. 20 offices here and there. And their headquarters is in Los Angeles. And somehow they saw fit, I guess they didn't know everything about him, to give him this job. And he's presently employed there. He has written articles for lots of magazines, architectural magazines that you're familiar with, and had his work published in Architectural Record and Progressive Architecture and AIE Journal and Architecture and Urbanism and a bunch of others. And he served as lecturer, he lectured and was visiting critic. I mean, I'm reading this because I don't know what he's done since I last saw him. I just have to read this. At UCLA and USC and Tokyo University, is this true? Boy, Costello and I have been teaching here all this time, and he's done this? I can't believe that. That's tremendous. Am I doing all right? And Ball State. And I heard him saying at dinner tonight that he went out to California, broke, and he almost got a job as a taxi driver, and he had to study a map to see where all the hotels were. And as soon as he got that memorized, and I know Mike, and for him that's a chore, and as soon as he got that memorized, all the locations of those hotels, the taxi drivers went on strike. And then what was the other thing he was going to do? He was going to be a security guard because he had short hair and black shoes. And they gave him a gun, and all you have to do was stand there. And somehow, he turned those opportunities down to be able to get a job working for an architectural firm and later for Daniel Mann Johnson and Mendenhall. And I'm sure that if he took that security job, as a security guard, it would be much more difficult for me to find an excuse to get him here to visit us tonight. And I seldom, and Tony seldom, guarantees the lecture. And in this is the 12th year I've been here. I've never guaranteed a lecture as a lecture being good or bad. And I haven't seen his slides, and I will, and I think Tony will endorse Mike Ross because he's a guy who's sincere, he's making an effort, he's trying to do a good job. And I'm sorry that he never became a taxi driver, because I'm sure if he did, he would have been a good taxi driver too. And it's a delight to have Mike Ross here tonight with us. Now be very careful. And here's his book. No. I bought this. He didn't even give me a copy. I bought this.
Thank you, Marvin.
Giving me a copy.
Can I wear this thing?
Buy this. This isn't cheap.
I guess not. I gotta hold it.
Yes, it goes around your neck. It goes around your neck.
We'll try it. We'll try it.
It goes around your neck and it clamps on right there.
Okay. High tech, right?
Now, my whole career is on the line here. If you don't give them a good lecture, they'll want their money back, and I won't be able to come back. You understand? I won't be able to give any more introductions or anything.
I want you to know that.
So for my sake, I don't even care
Okay.
about them, but I hope you
Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the upper balcony there? Oh, there we go. I guess you have a man in the audio booth. Okay. Where's the audio? Oh, there's the audio. Oh, but wait a second. I'm going to just leave it at that height. How's that? How's that? I understand Marvin's job is on the line, and I've been brought in to see what I can do to help terminate it. Let's see. Okay. I'm very honored to be here tonight. It's really a thrill for me to come all the way from Los Angeles back to Indiana. I did work on the Occupational Health Center in Columbus for several years as a project architect, and it's a job I'm very fond of, and it's a part of the country I really like. The lecture tonight is an attempt on my part to condense Japanese architectural history into an hour, which is of course impossible. It's a history lesson. I lived there from on and off from 68, 72, and then after I left Hardy Holzman Pfeiffer in 72, and I lived there 72 to 74. I was on the faculty at Tokyo University in Kenzo Tangei's studio, for those of you who know who Tangei is. And I studied Japanese, and I've always been fascinated by the country and by their architecture, both traditional and modern. And they're doing a lot of fascinating things. I understand from Marv you get Architecture and Urbanism, A+U, and Japan Architect in your library, so you're familiar with some of the stuff they've done. And I will try and put it in some kind of perspective. I would like to invite the students who are going to China, and all of you, in fact, to take over for me. And I'm hoping that someone else will go to Japan and learn Japanese and learn what the Japanese architects are doing and update the book that I wrote. Because what I've done is try to show you what's been happening from 1960 through to the present. But there's a lot of things that are happening right now. There are young architects who are working, who are unknown, and who I think you would probably be very interested in meeting. Without any further introduction, let's start with the slides. Let's see what I can... Okay, we got one on. How do we get that one on? Do I do that? No. Can you make the one on the right go back one? Thank you. For those of you who, let's see, I'm on mobile here? Yeah, I'm pretty mobile. I won't trip. For those of you who can't see this book cover, I made some larger. That's the title of the lecture, and that's the book cover. It's also published in Japanese for those of you who can't read English. Now let's see. I don't know which one moved that slide. Okay, the left one isn't working. So someone has to move it for me. Thanks. The structure of the lecture, just to give you an overview, the first thing I'm going to do is just try to introduce you to Japanese culture. Just give you a little feel for the place, and then we'll take a look at what modern Japan is up to, and then we'll try to trace traditional Japanese architecture. I have a note here. I can't remember exactly where it is. Oh yeah, here it is. On January, I have some notes. Every once in a while, I'll read just a fact that'll be absolutely accurate because I have it written down. On January 26, 1974, almost 5.5 years ago, Emperor of Japan, Emperor Hirohito and his wife, celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, commemorating 2,634 years of unbroken imperial lineage. So that's almost 2,640 years that country has been maintaining its traditions. So it's a country very, very steeped in tradition, much more than our 200 years can even come close to. The traditions date back 650 years before the birth of Christ. So just to give you a sense of what some of the traditional forms, textures, and designs are, I've put up a couple of lanterns designed by Isamu Noguchi. If I press both of them, only one goes ahead, and then my friend helps me. Good. It's an agrarian country built on rice paddies and tile roofs. Oh, gee, that worked. Now let's see. I just want to see how these focusing things work. They don't work. Yeah, the forward and backward is working perfectly. Thanks. No, they are. The focus isn't, but maybe some people up there will help me. Okay, it's a country that has grown up with a great deal of natural bamboo. That's bamboo in the wild. That's an example of how it's used to make a gate. And it's a country of a variety of kinds of traditional architecture. You've got the traditional farmhouse on the left and the traditional castle on the right. And there's a lot of kinds of traditions. There's the tradition of putting your mattress out in the sun every day, the futon, which are these red and white patterned quilts that you see. And these people have a little store on the bottom floor. See their telephone, and they sell cigarettes. Excuse me. And then upstairs is their apartment, right in the heart of Tokyo, near where I used to live. And they put their futon out every day so it can get its sun. And then, of course, there's the traditional Japanese dress worn by a senior citizen couple out in the country outside Kyoto, or by a modern couple in the heart of Tokyo on certain special occasions. There's the traditional hairstyle worn by this actor and actress who are preparing for a samurai film. And then there are some traditions which never die. These girls are called Maiko, M-A-I-K-O, and they have the white face and the real high wedge-shaped shoes and the real long obi, the sash hanging in the back. And I was on a trip to Kyoto at this time, and I got off the train, and there they were. And they've been doing this for thousands of years. They're not geisha. They're called apprentice geisha. They're young girls, and they wait for businessmen who are coming from Tokyo to Kyoto. It's a little bit like coming from Los Angeles to Muncie, you know. And they are there to show their hosts around. I mean, to serve as hosts, to show their guests around, and to make them feel at home. And they used to be waiting at the end of a dirt road where the guy would arrive on a little cart being pulled by somebody. Now he arrives on a high-tech 125-mile-an-hour train, but the outfit's unchanged. The sumo wrestlers, which still exist today, date back to an earlier style that goes back again as far as the birth of Christ. And so there's a real steep tradition in Japan. The 2 points I'd like to make about the tradition are as follows. First of all, everything in Japan that's cultural, and I said this to some of the students who are going to China today, was borrowed. They borrowed, and I'll document this a little later in my slides, Chinese, the alphabet, the religion, the architecture, the ceramics, and then they would close their doors and kind of, what's happening? He's after me. And they would kind of digest them and make them their own. The other thing that happens that's not quite as well recognized is that the Japanese are quite happy to accept two contradictory positions simultaneously. They'll accept a Western position and an Eastern position. They'll accept something traditional and something very modern and very innovative, both at the same time. Let me see if I can give you some examples of these 2 points. This is some slides of Horyuji Temple, which is the oldest wooden buildings in the world. They were built in 607 AD without any metal parts, all interlocking. There's the same Japanese couple. I was very lucky when I visited this temple because I was there on a day when there were no students, no other visitors, and it looks essentially the same way it's looked, for over 1,000 years. This is the Golden Hall on the left and a model of it on the right. And the model is based on traditional Korean and Chinese measuring dimensions. So it's really something that the Japanese borrowed from China and Korea and then recreate it. Their alphabet, I just threw up a couple of words. This is dai, which means big, and that's hataraku, which means work. The thing that's interesting about both characters is that there's a formal way to write it. See, is this? Yeah, like this, and like this. And every single stroke has a sequence. You know, you can't do this one first. You have to do this one first, and then 2, and then 3. And not only do you have to do the strokes in order, but when you simplify it, you can't just decide I'm going to drop this one off or drop that one off. You have to simplify it in a very prescribed fashion. I studied calligraphy for quite a while when I was there, and there's tradition, and then when you try to depart from tradition, there's even tradition. This is the Todaiji. It's the largest wooden building in existence in the world, built in the 8th century. And basically, this style was borrowed from Han Dynasty, China. They're the famous family crests that the Japanese, beautiful works of graphic design, also borrowed from Chinese graphic designers. And then there's the religion of Buddhism itself, which originated in India and then moved through China and Korea to Japan. So I think we've made it clear that the Japanese are quite happy borrowing things and making them their own. And you'll see how they do that with modern architecture. The other thing that's incredible is the ability to accept two divergent or contradictory positions. And I would just like to read a short quote from a book called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which in its title makes it clear that on the one hand they're very aesthetic, and on the other hand they're very militaristic. Ruth Benedict, an American sociologist, said, the Japanese are, and I quote, both aggressive and unaggressive, militaristic and aesthetic, both insolent and polite, rigid and adaptable, submissive and resentful of being pushed around, loyal and treacherous, brave and timid, conservative and hospitable to new ways, end quote. That's the key thing. They're conservative, and yet they're hospitable to new ways. They want to stick to what's Japanese, but they're perfectly happy to accept something new and radical. And these two buildings were both designed at the same time. You've got Nikko, the mausoleum at Nikko on the right on the left, and the Katsura detached palace on the right. One is very ornate, very Baroque, kind of like Borromini might do in Western culture, and the other is very restrained, very simple, very Bauhaus. And they were both done at the same period, and they're both considered good architecture, just two distinctly different styles. Another photograph of the same two projects. They're even quite happy doing a bridge that has two completely different ends. One's one style and one's the other style. Now, as I mentioned, sumo goes back thousands of years, and it was traditionally an ancient Shinto religious festival. And when modern society grew, and in Tokyo, you've got to accommodate 20,000 people, they built a huge concrete stadium for the sumo contests. And but they didn't want to give up the old Shinto shrine, so they just hung a Shinto shrine inside the concrete building, and they've got modern and traditional at the same time. Okay. Well, that's a glimpse of Japan, its traditions, and a little bit of the idea of accepting two contradictory positions at the same time. The next series of slides deal with what's happened since the war. And there's a number of Japanologists, as they're called, who have studied the sociology and the political situation. And Japan never experienced a defeat before in her 2,600-year history until World War II. And so they were determined to find out what the hell it was that beat them. And so they sent a lot of scientists and engineers to the United States and have borrowed our technology. I'm sure you're aware of this. The transistor was discovered, invented, whatever, in this country. But in Japan, it's electric technology, the automobile technology, and a lot of other kinds of technology are moving ahead faster than in the West. They're quite happy to show. My voice keeps changing volume. Can you hear me? No? Yes? Yeah. Okay, thanks. What'd you say? No, that's... you all remember Band-Aids? Now they're called shear plasters. pledge. You see advertisements on TV for your favorite American product. There are even some very weird reinterpretations of Western culture. This is a late-night Japanese cultural show where they have a woman in a kimono, a matronly woman of 50 years or more, showing how you can get a mud bath at night, or how you can get your breasts build up using a vacuum suction cup. Very weird. They have, topless fashion shows and imitations of Western culture. In traditional Japan, these are woodblock prints. Everybody had them around the house, like you have Playboy today. They were considered normal part of everyday life. And in the 20th century, you get this kind of reinterpretation of Las Vegas. But I think something has been lost in translation. That's loud. Now probably most of you can't read the names of these magazines. They're Japanese magazines, again, which in a kind of distorted way are borrowing elements of Western culture. This magazine is named after an English satirical magazine. The phonetic pronunciation of the magazine is Punch, which, the British magazine Punch. This one, if you pronounce each one of these Japanese letters very carefully, it says, Pure boy. And that's right. But the contents are really quite different. There's a little different things that you really can't see. This says VIP interview, Beach Boys over here, and a number of other different things. So they're trying to be Western, but something, again, gets lost in translation. And that starts to happen in the architecture as well. And I think as we move through the architecture, you'll see, kind of references to Corbusier or references to Frank Lloyd Wright or references to other Western prototypes which have somehow changed. Now, I Xeroxed a page out of the book. I think you all have this one on the right, don't you? Oh, no. You have this one on the left. The title of the lecture and the title of the book is Beyond Metabolism, and some people think it's a new diet or how to live after death. But in 1960, there was a group of Japanese architects, and they called themselves the Metabolist Group. And I'm sure you all remember that metabolism is a biological process which covers the breaking down and replacing of protoplasm in the body. And the metabolists felt that they wanted to take that name because they were interested in the city being more flexible. After the war, they didn't want a dead kind of urban design. They wanted one that was alive, that was metabolist, that you could break down parts, that discard them and replace them with new parts. So I'm going to try and show you the work of some of these key people. The reason I handed these names out, I was saying earlier today, that the five metabolists were Kisho Kurokawa, Fumihiko Maki, Masato Otaka, Kiyonori Kikutake, and Noboru Kawazoe. Kawazoe was actually a journalist who wrote about the other four. But I'll be showing the work of these four people primarily, plus Arata Isozaki, right here, Isozaki, who, all of these people, these three especially, all worked for Tange. It's very interesting. Tange was really, in many ways, the leader of the group, but he worked for Maekawa. Maekawa is a very unique guy in Japanese architectural history because he worked for Corbusier. Maekawa actually worked on the Villa Savoy, he's known as the project architect, and also on the Swiss Pavilion, for those of you who... So, the thing I distributed to everybody is just to help you with the names. First, I'd like to show you the first thing that kind of caught the eye of the international design community was Tange's plan for Tokyo, 1960. And it was a city that floated on Tokyo Bay with these loops. It was a highway that went through the city, and then he had these spines coming off of them with these large enclosed communication spaces. And a detail of the plan for Tokyo was called the Tsukiji Plant. And in the Tsukiji Plan, Tange introduced these bridge elements. The idea was that certain parts of the city would be long-term, they would last a long time, and other parts of the city could be replaced, discarded, metabolism, remember? So you'd have these vertical core shafts which carried kind of the guts of the city. plumbing, structure, and the bridge elements, and then you could plug in pieces as technology evolved. It was kind of a futurist notion. And each of the metabolist members of the group decided to do their own version of a megastructure or a metabolist city. This is called Helix City. It's designed by Kurokawa. And there are some bridge elements which connect these large megastructures in the sky. It was also designed to float on water because of the density of Japan. They didn't have enough space. Oh, what happened? Which one did I miss? Thanks. This was, it's interesting, you know, Chicago's not very far away. This came out about the time that Goldsmith or Goldfinger? What's his name? Bertrand Goldberg was designing the Marina City in Chicago. And Kiyonori Kikutake thought it was a great idea, but two weren't enough. So he made a whole series of these vertical towers. The difference is that he had these little plug-in modules, see, that could just be stuck on. Sometimes they floated on these pods, and other times they just grew right out of Tokyo Bay. And then Fumihiko Maki designed another city with large atrium spaces and urban fill-in. One of the most interesting was a prototype designed by Isozaki, whose name will come up again and again tonight. Isozaki designed these things as if they were huge trees, really. These were like trunks of trees with branches, and each housing unit was kind of like a leaf in concept, you know. And he did detailed drawings showing how the core shafts were about like these huge trunks. Look at the scale figure. These are 650 meters high. What does that come out to in feet? Anyway, 1,800 feet, 1,900 feet high. And then these bridge elements connecting off of them. And he was in Tangei's office at the time he did these, although he did them on his own. And then later, Tangei's office built this building. And I think it's pretty clear that, does that work? That was the precursor of that. There's the vertical core shafts, the teeth, you know, and the prefab bridge elements, and it's all part of this concept of interchangeability of parts, and the city doesn't have to be permanent. Of course, it was a little out of place in relationship to the traditional Japanese town, but it was a prototype. It was meant to show the way to the future. And in fact, this building has been added onto. I took these slides in 1968, and Tangei has added onto it using the same system of vertical core shafts and plug-in bridge elements. Then, in 1966, I believe it was, Japan Architect magazine had a housing competition, just like they have now. I think last year Charles Moore was the juror. I don't remember. But this, in 1966, the juror was Kenzo Tangei, who does all these prefab things. And he wanted everyone to submit a city of the future. This is the first prize by Akira Shibuya, and it has everything that all the other elements of all the other megastructures ever had. It has the prefab capsule units. It's got the large bridge elements. It's got, you know, things being brought in by helicopter. It's got rapid transit systems. It has everything that, there you go, there's your prefab housing unit being brought in, that the mind could conceive, but a little bit like Paolo Soleri out in Arizona. The thing was like a dinosaur. Rainer Banham wrote in his book Megastructures that this was the dinosaur of the modern movement. They were just too clumsy, too big, too out of context to work. They were really idea sketches. No one really expected them to be built. But the Japanese continued to look to what the West was doing and to borrow and to build. Now on the left, we have a sketch by the English architect Peter Cook for Expo 67 in Montreal. It was an Expo tower. And 3 years later at Expo 70, Kiyonori Kikutake, one of your original metabolists, did what is clearly a takeoff on this thing with the kind of Sputnik-like aerospace prefab capsules floating up there in space. Really pretty dramatic to go and see it. And they were trying to use space-age technology as a symbolic gesture in architecture. Again, a sketch by Warren Chalk of the English group Archigram for a bunch of capsule homes wrapped around a concrete core, and a somewhat diminutive version just outside Kyoto by Nakajima with a bunch of prefab, plexiglass, fiber-filled cores off a concrete core shaft. And that Expo 70 was really a chance for the metabolists to show their stuff. The main reason was, everybody knows an expo is something you build and take apart. So the idea of buildings which could be put up and taken down was perfect for the metabolists, because their whole idea was that things plug in, you take them apart. So he did these giant, kind of expose the structure, and you have the silver plug-in pavilions. And really quite exciting, actually. Kurokawa is a very visionary architect. Then he decided to try and take the ideas that he used at Expo 70 and apply them to real projects. And this is in Sapporo, which is the northernmost island. And instead of using those metal things, he went to prefab concrete, a little like Moshe Safdie used at Expo 67. But they were too heavy, too bulky, too cumbersome, and eventually too expensive, just like Safdie's were. So in his next project, he went to the Japanese shipbuilding industry. Japanese really pioneered containerization. And he developed this, with this company that was building shipping containers, these housing units. What happened? Anyway, they look like that. I guess that slide didn't drop. Let's see what the next one looks like. The thing that's interesting is, on the right, you get this very modern-looking, plug-in, high-tech, prefab capsule, but aesthetically, it owes a great deal to the traditional Japanese puzzle. Visually, the interlocking rectangular elements, I think you can see very clearly, are in many ways traditional. So here's an example of something which is both traditional and contemporary. In 1948, I believe it was, Le Corbusier proposed a system for the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, France, for a prefab unit that would slide into a steel or concrete structure. But technology wasn't ready for it, and Corbu had to build his building using traditional reinforced concrete. But lo and behold, in 1972, there's your steel frame and there's the capsule sliding right in, which, the Japanese took a Western idea and built it. But I point out to you again, the idea of sliding this element into a larger surface is, again, based on the whole idea of the Japanese puzzle. Here's a look at what's going on inside the capsule. And remember that the Japanese live in very dense conditions. It's very common for a married couple to live in a room no larger than 9 by 12, which is essentially the size of this capsule. Has a double bed, has a chair which slides over to the desk, has a calculator, typewriter, sink. This flips up to a double burner stove, has a bathtub, toilet, sink. It's a whole universe in a 9 by 12 space, a lot like a spaceship in many ways. It hooks up right here to the mothership. I like this slide, the slide on the left, because these are JNR, Japan National Railway containers. And it's the same company that builds these, that builds the Nakagin capsule building. You can take them and you can put them on the back of a flatbed truck, take them anywhere a truck will go. You can put them on a ship, take them anywhere a ship will go, and they unload them using these large rigs. And that's essentially what the Nakagin capsule building was about. It was all designed on a grid. This system that you're seeing here was developed at Tokyo University by a bunch of graduate students in architecture and engineering. And it's a way of expanding the concept of the box unit. Let's see. There's a few examples of. In their system, not only was the box flexible, but the structure itself was flexible, so that both elements could be prefabbed and interlocked and put together. Many of you may be familiar with the author Bernard Rudovsky. He wrote Architecture Without Architects. He wrote Street for People. He also lived in Japan for a while, and he wrote a book called The Kimono Mind. And in it, he talks about Japanese idea of standardization. He says, and I quote Rudovsky, "Centuries before we even thought of standardization, prefabrication, and mobility as architectural possibilities, The Japanese applied them to their houses as a matter of course. See, the whole idea of the Japanese mat, the tatami mat, that is a modular. I mean, it's, it's like Mises modular. What happened here? Oops. Can we get this one here? I'm dead on the left again. I need a lift. Hello? Can you advance the left projector, please? Thanks. No, you pressed the wrong button. There you go. One of the students who was doing his PhD at Tokyo University designed that box unit system that you just saw, and then he went to a housing manufacturer and said, hey, look at my thesis, isn't it neat? Why don't we try and build it? And they developed these box units in a whole series of different, I mean, this is a very small example of the number of variations that are possible using these box units. Works. And here they are being prefabricated on an assembly line, very much like an automobile, and they can make 5 units an hour. I believe, let me see if that's right, I can't remember. 1 unit every 5 minutes. 12 units an hour. You can do a complete house for $35,000, plus the foundations. But the box unit, in and of itself, the Nakagin capsule, is a little too confining. The one that's on the cover of the book, 9 by 12, it starts to get claustrophobic after a while. Give me another box. So that's what Kurokawa did. He said, we'll give you 3. And you can have a bedroom sleeping type capsule. You can have a kind of, recreational capsule. And you can have the service core, the service capsule over here with kitchen, bath, and everything. And they built a prototype. This cost extra. And no male chauvinism. No male chauvinism. And Kurokawa developed several prototypes. One was a megastructure, a little bit like something Stanley Tigerman did for a tetrahedral city. And the other idea was to just build it into the hillside. And this scheme is actually going ahead as a leisure village on the Isu Peninsula. Excuse me. The idea of mixing technologies is even possible at the small residential scale. Kurokawa built a little retreat for himself at Karuizawa. And the house is like a mini Nakagin capsule building. It's got the concrete core shaft in the middle, and these are like core 10 steel capsules on the outside. Very modern, very high-tech. The steel rusts, and then it creates this coating which prevents rusting for all time in the future. The thing that's really interesting to me is, within these various capsules, he creates one that's a tea ceremony capsule. And you see it's got a 4.5 mat room. There's a blow-up of it over here, with the tokonoma, or alcove, where you put the Japanese flower arrangement. Over here is the brassiere, where you heat the tea. And so what's happening is it's a real mixture of old and new. In fact, this tea ceremony room is based on a 100-year-old tea ceremony room designed by a famous Japanese tea master named Kobori Enshu. I think we have a few shots. So, you get the core 10 steel on the outside, and then the sort of woody country house on the inside with the traditional Japanese rice mats, shoji screens. So I think this is a good example of being able to accept 2 divergent positions simultaneously. Another building I really get a kick out of is this. This is the Kibogaoka Youth Castle. It's like a Boy Scout camp. It's a retreat way out in the hills, about an hour and a half from Kyoto. I mean, see, it's surrounded by open space. And these are places where Boy Scouts can go and sleep overnight. It's a little like a tent, but it's up in the air. The Nakagin capsule building was made of steel. And these are like, you might call that the Model T of capsules. And this one is made of fiber-reinforced plastic, kind of the Corvette version. Anyway, it's a real mixture. It's an assemblage of prefab components. And you'll see inside anything goes. Even David. I mean, how did Michelangelo get in the act? Well, what actually happened was, at Expo 70 at the Italian Pavilion, they sent a replica of Michelangelo's David. And this particular local prefecture, it's the Shunga prefecture, they bought it, and the Italian government was very glad to have it on permanent display. And it's so interesting to have this kind of traditional piece of Western art next to this Saturn V rocket booster over here, and which is actually an air conditioning duct, you know. And then this is a tent structure. This is canvas. I don't know if you can see it. And this little canvas thing off here is actually the men's room. So it's a real mixed bag of traditional and modern. And when you go outside the building, you see this very, to me, awkward appendage stuck on the building. What are these, you know, what is this thing glued on here? Well, it's actually a piece of fiber reinforced plastic dome on the outside. On the inside, it creates a very warm, translucent light for the traditional Japanese bath. You see, you wash up along the edge here, kneeling with soap, and then you douse yourself with water from these buckets, and then you go in and soak in the hot tub. So it's really a nice assemblage of pieces of technology. Now, some architects get carried away with high technology in Japan and in the United States. And this is an apartment house by an architect named Yoji Watanabe. It's called the New Sky Building No. 3. And all of this stuff here that looks like antennas, and this looks like maybe the top of a submarine, it's all facade. I mean, this is what I call the techno-aesthetic. It's a facade of technology. These, what seem to be kind of Airstream mobile homes maybe, stacked up on top of each other, it's just a metal skin glued on a traditional building. I admit it's got a lot of visual appeal. But when you get inside the building, you know, this is the plan. Let's see if I can trace. You get off the elevator here, and this is, let's see, this is the front hall. Then you take off your coat, and you go in. All of this is part of the same apartment. This long, narrow, not very interesting hallway. I'd say it's about a C-. Well, I don't know. The inside plan isn't that good. And I asked Watanabe when we went there together, what is this thing going on up here? And he said that he was a lieutenant in the Navy during the war. It's true. And he wanted to, you know, it's postmodernism taken to its most bizarre extreme. The next couple of buildings he did, he wanted to do also in silver. This is the New Sky Building No. 5, envisioned initially in stainless steel, real shiny, but finally built in just kind of worn out concrete. This building is in Charles Jank's new book called Bizarre Architecture. And in it, he says in quotations that it has exhaust pipes for dragging down the street. And the quotations, by the way, are from page 153 of this book over here. But anyway, Charles is a good friend, and I think he recognizes bizarre architecture when he sees it. This is a private house Watanabe did. Again, he wanted it to be a little silver capsule, but he couldn't do it, so he built the whole thing in black and took me to see it. And again, it's a very sculptural thing, but I think one has to, as an architect, discern between what's kind of visually appealing and what works. And inside, it just doesn't function that well. Now, going back again to traditional Japanese architecture, there's a couple of things that they're very well known for. This is the Kiyomizu-Dera temple in Kyoto. I think you can see it's supported by a large array of interlocking wooden space frame. And this is a detail from one of my favorite temples in Nara, Todaiji. It's just a real nice 1,200-year-old detail. And the contemporary architects after the war, the metabolists, they had grown up on this. They didn't know about Michelangelo and Borromini. They knew about traditional Japanese architecture and the interlocking elements. And one of them, several of them in fact, like Masato Otaka, who's on your list, he developed this town hall using precast concrete, a contemporary material, but I would say very clearly evoking a traditional Japanese aesthetic. Again, in detail, you know, the whole way the concrete interlocks and overlaps, and I get that feel of those old Todaiji joints. Another incredible job. This was done when this This project was an international design competition. I think it was won in about 1963 when I was in college, and I remember looking through the Japan architect and, wow, look at these incredible things these guys are doing. And that was part of when I really got interested in going there. This is by Otani, Sachio Otani. Otani, to give you an idea, you think you work for a long time for an architect. He worked for Tange for 14 years and worked his way up from junior designer, senior designer, project job captain, eventually to Tange's senior man. And finally he won this competition and opened his own office. But today, he is still Tange's disciple. In Tange's studio at Tokyo University, when Tange has to go away to an international design conference or something, Otani steps in and runs the studio. Anyway, this building, again, these pictures were taken in '68. That Toyota taxi there will attest to that. I think is reminiscent of the traditional Japanese, again, the interlocking kind of wood elements. And I found this is a traditional Shinto shrine. And I think it's quite clear that the angle of the wood and the way the things overlap and the way they're clustered together, one can get a sense that it's a very modern building, there's no doubt about that, but there's a sensitivity to the traditional Japanese way of building. I think we have a carousel tray break here. Everyone, I'll take a sip of this. Everybody still awake? Oh, okay. Marvin, wake up. Okay. Okay, can we focus the slide on the left? Please, thank you. Halfway over. The whole idea, as I was saying, of taking traditional Japanese architecture and bringing it up into the present, it has sometimes different kinds of interpretations by different kinds of architects. This is a very elaborate contemporary Japanese religious structure. It's called a shohondo. Is that it up here somewhere? Anyway, Tsukiji. Anyway, oh, here it is, the shohondo, number 1. It's right here. And all of this stuff is the approach. Now, let me tell you something about sequence of spaces, you designers. They have to be interesting. And in traditional Japanese architecture, they are. You might come upon a small gate, and with a little glimpse of what's beyond, you have to go around a garden and past a pond, and then you'll see 3/4 angle view of the building you're approaching, and then finally you get there. This building doesn't do that quite as well. It's a little heavy-handed, but still quite interesting in that this is like a traditional Japanese gate, formerly made of wood, now made of pre-stressed, post-tension concrete. I get a kick out of that overlapping. But this over here is over here. This is 30. Okay, now I'm not going to take you through all the slides. 3 rolls of film I took. But the next picture gets us pretty far up the route. Then you go up this enormous grand staircase. This is one particular sect of Buddhism, and I certainly accept the religious beliefs of the people. I think the architect let monumentality go a little bit to his head, but I want you to see it. Here's an isometric, and here you get a shot from the rice paddies out there, wet feet in this photograph. Anyway, there's the Garden of the Law, which is the first phase. Then you move through the very unpretentiously titled Pavilion of Perfect Harmony. Then you move into the Temple of Purification, and finally you arrive at the Mystic Sanctuary. And you can see the 3 stages. This is the Pavilion of Perfect Harmony. These 4 things over here represent the Temple of Purification, and this is the Mystic Sanctuary. And that's Fuji in the background, Mount Fuji. It's a phenomenal site. I mean, just to go and visit, it's really impressive. This is the Temple of Purification on the scale of the Temple of Karnak in Egypt. You're in the presence of something very mighty, there's no doubt about it. And then you move through the Pavilion of Perfect Harmony to the Temple of Purification, and finally the Mystic Sanctuary. Have a drum roll? There you go. And it's a dramatic space, there's no question about it. Kimiyo Yokoyama did pull off a very dramatic space. There's a lot of things going on, and you kind of go like that when you enter the space. But for me, as your visiting Japanese architectural critic, I still like Tangei's 1964 Olympic Stadium as a little more reserved, a little more elegant, and I don't have a picture of the interior, but he can fit just as many people inside that swimming stadium as Yokoyama did, with a lot less acrobatics, if you will. Now, the next architect I want to discuss is Fumihiko Maki. Maki is one of the original metabolists. He did one of those crazy megastructures you saw, 80 slides ago. But Maki was a little different from his contemporaries because he came to the Midwest. He got a master's from Cranbrook, and after graduating from Tangei Studio, and then he went on to Harvard and got another master's, and then he went to the University of Washington in St. Louis to teach for a while, and he really, I think, absorbed a lot of what Western culture is about, and then went back to Japan and and then he won a Graham Foundation grant and went around the world, then went back to Japan and opened his own office. And this is an elementary school. It's the first open plan school in Japan where you can have a complete open classroom, or can break it down into little clusters. And I just want you to notice in the scheme, he's kind of carved slots or holes or gardens in here so that between each room you get a space that lets light in. It also allows the younger students a chance to see what the older students are doing, and it acts like a thick transparent wall. You get an idea, well, when I get to be 7, I get to do that. And here's the way the building looks in the landscape. It's kind of technological, but low scale, especially designed for kids. The kids come in under this low element. So, it's sort of at the scale of elementary school. You pass through these doors into this space, and then there are these lockers. And what Maki, I think, does well is the buildings don't give it all away on the outside. Once you get inside, all that kind of gray disappears, and the elementary school colorful coloring book stuff starts happening. The super graphics are by Ray Komai, by the way, a Japanese American who was living in Japan. Obviously, that's the girls' room. And this is, where you study your ABCs. Even in elementary school, they start learning our alphabet. I mean, that's where the cultures start overlapping. And this is the art room, and he's done a little trompe l'oeil here where you can't quite tell whether this cube is receding or projecting in space. And he's doing some visual things which I think make the school interesting and make it a fun place for the kids. These are examples of some of those garden kind of spaces. Uses skylights to bring light down into the space. Good school. Now, at a certain larger scale, this is a university building at a place called Tsukuba, spelled like scuba but with a T. And this is the central hall. It has a double function, okay? On a campus scale, it has to serve as a gateway. People approach from down here and they come up through it, and the campus is up that way, all right? And on the other hand, it has to link together the functions that are on either side. So it's kind of a bridge scheme. It's also a symbolic scheme. And here's the early drawing for the building, and as it is completed, and you can pass right through it, right underneath the middle. And Maki is interested in technology, but not for technology's sake. He's interested in it in ways that'll help get the building built. And I'll show you later how that skin went on. Inside the building, it's not a bunch of boxes. He's carved a big hole. It's a little hard to capture but there's balconies and various sections. And it's like, again, that little elementary school blown up to university size. Here you see, these are glass block, but they're not laid one block at a time. They're prefabricated on the ground and lifted up by crane in big panels. So it's a gesture towards prefab. It's kind of on-site prefabrication. And when you get into the whole issue of how to convert your ingenious designs into reality, you get into questions of time and money. And Maki is very good at taking a good design and figuring out a technology that makes sense for it. Excuse me. Some other examples of architecture have evolved from the early prefab systems. This is Arata Isozaki, who you remember did the big tall columns with the teeth sticking out, and he was a real metabolist. And he was in Chicago last year as part of that New Wave series at the Graham Foundation, and he's a little bit hard to figure out. I had an X-ray taken, and you can see what the inside of his head looks like. Tracing quickly the kind of things that Isozaki has gone through. In '62, when Paul Rudolph was doing his art and architecture building for Yale, which was a real brutal béton brute concrete thing, Isozaki, pardon me, was developing this library for Oita, his hometown. Don't forget your hometown, kids. You'll go back someday and the mayor will give you a commission. Anyway, this is a little bit like some of the other concrete things we saw with the interlocking elements, but it's more abstract. One of the students I spoke to today said the Japanese are interested in abstraction and perfection, and I think you'll see Isozaki is a good example of abstraction and perfection. These are ducks, surely, but he's taken them and he's using them in an expressionist way. Now, right across the street from the library, they were so happy with that library that they gave him a job to do a medical center. And in 1963 and 4, he did this medical center, and it used to stop right here, just this truncated kind of elephant leg thing. And then this piece in the back was added 12 years later. So remember, when you do a design, if they like it, they're going to call you back. You're going to have to work with your own building. So this is the first piece. And then they multiplied the program 3 times and added all of this. And it created an interesting opportunity for Isozaki because this exterior facade over here used to be the same as the one over here. But now what was once outside becomes inside. And it creates a kind of ambiguity that I think is enriching in architecture. Here, right here, you can see the old exterior covered with a skylight, and in the new inside he creates these bridges and balconies and a big, large open space, and gives you a sense of what used to be old is now new. Oh, I missed a button here. Which one is it? That one. It's a difficult building to photograph because there really isn't a first floor, second floor, third floor. It's a whole series of terraces floating in space. And this is in fact, the first floor. The secretaries are down there working. Then you come up the elevator, and you look across the bridge. You come out here. This is the new wing. You look across the bridge, and you see the old facade, which is now part of the inside of this big reception area. It's really a lot of fun. And then you work up these steps, and they're like, third levels or half levels to these little study carrels. It's a medical research building, until eventually you get up inside the major space. And remember when you draw your sections that the ceiling doesn't have to be flat. This is a worm's eye view, as it were, lying on the floor looking up at the clear story lighting, which I think is a very successful space. The quality of light, the way the floor, which you can't see here, steps down in a series of semicircular terraces, and the way the ceiling steps up in a kind of telescoping series of semicircular terraces. The ceiling reflects the floor space, the light filters in. Isozaki's really interested in a variety of things in architecture. He's interested in molding space, and every once in a while he gives you a little flashback to, remember me, I was interested in high technology once. And this here is the ceiling over here. See these ribs? And these are the air diffusers for the air conditioning system. And we'll give you just a feel for, then he'll use dark glass as a reflector to create ambiguity and reflection and a kind of, the space. It's more than just one space. In a very small space, he creates a great deal of interest. Controversial kind of building, because, when we were in school, there was an attitude, the building has to be consistent. I mean, I don't want you dragging in pieces of this building and gluing it onto this building, because then it's not consistent. Well, Isozaki somehow missed that course. And I'll read you some of the things he says. He believes that it's fine to have different elements express themselves differently on the building. Okay, I call him a mannerist architect, and I got out my history book and I looked up Wiley's cipher says mannerism is marked by disproportion, disturbed balance, ambiguity, and clashing impulses. Isozaki believes each element should be treated, and I quote, as an individual thing, designed to conform only to its own circumstances and unrelated to the whole. I realize every time I look up, I fake out the audio guy, I'm sorry. But what's happening here is, from an urban design point of view, this is a big wall, and it frames a plaza, which is across the street. It's the main train station of the city. And then, in front of this big wall, what seems to be, at least to me, like a scenic railway with these kind of exhaust pipes for, you get a detail of this, so you can just sort of hear it, revving up and about to pull out down the street. But there's a tension there, because in one case, there's implied motion, in the other case, there's this very stolid, very heavy, big, huge slab that says you're not going anywhere. So that creates a kind of visual tension. These are, in fact, air intakes and exhausts for the mechanical system. And then, there's the president and vice president's office, and they get a little special treatment on the facade. And you have to tell people where the front door is. That's a lot, a lot of things people forget. So the front door gets a big special marble number, which looks like this. And then there's the world's largest telephone booth inside, 12 feet in diameter. You stand in here, you make a call, and you hear your echo over and over. So he's an interesting architect. You pass through this sort of Art Deco light fixture, and you go up to a floor. This is a painting by actually an American artist, Sam Francis. All the walls, floors, and ceilings are black with this one painting, and the receptionist. Receptionist went away for that photograph. Just a second. Now, off this dark hallway are meeting rooms, very formal. You recognize the Marcel Breuer Wassenaar chair? Is that right? Very good. And over here, Tobias Scarpa is an Italian designer. This room was designed by Isozaki. It is a perfect cube, okay, made up of concentric squares around the ceiling, the walls, even the carpet is all squares. And what's kind of funny is, you see these little mirrors here? When you're walking in the space, they're eye level. And occasionally you'll pass by one at 45 degrees, and without realizing it, you'll be getting a double reflection. And you think you're looking into the next room, but you're really doing, sort of looking behind your shoulder. It's just a visual game that some architects like to play. I mean, the room functions fine. You sit around the coffee table and have the meeting. But it's that kind of additional visual, stylistic game that Isozaki plays beyond the function of the building. This is, again, another meeting room with a big eye by Dada artist Man Ray, like Big Brother is looking at you. This is a room for multilingual conversations. Each one of these silver booths has interpreters in it. You plug in your headset here, and you can, borrow 2 million yen to build a bank in Shanghai or something. And then it's one of my favorite rooms. You have to go across this bridge, and over here is an entirely separate room. It has its own telephone, its own electrical, mechanical system. It's for super private meetings. And then upstairs, the rest of the staff, he lets his electrical conduits hang out, does a little kind of, I think, expressionist number with his ductwork, some super graphics. And so it's a mixture of high-tech imagery and exposing low-tech elements. It's the kind of thing that California architect Frank Gehry is doing in an expressionist sort of way. Now, Isozaki has gone through a whole lot of various changes, and I'll just try and take you through some of them. These are some more branches for this Fukuoka Sogo Bank. This is the concept. The concept is it's a bunch of square grids. Does that train come through here?
It's not going to come up to the door.
Oh, okay. And then inside, the square grids are on the floor, they're on the ceiling. It's a little bit like that cubicle room. You're not quite sure what's up and what's down. He carves away at the square grid. And these are okay buildings. They're not great, but they're working towards something that I want to build up to. Then his next bank was a little branch bank. Again, all square grid. This time he started wrapping around the corner. There was with a billboard on the site in the parking lot. And the owner was making money, revenue off that billboard, and he didn't want to give it away. And Isozaki didn't want it in front of his building, so he just made it part of the building. And this is a little billboard that changes every month. The home bank. And this is a prefab stainless steel sandwich panel system, which later evolved into a much larger building. This is the Gunma Prefectural Museum of Art. And it's designed as a cluster of cubes stepping down. This one twists out, creating, again, two platforms, one receding and one projecting up for the display of sculpture. You get a sense of what it's a very exciting museum, very abstract, serene. But remember, the museum is to be a backdrop for art, and so there should be a certain kind of neutral quality about it. One of the things he did in it, which is very mannerist and very entertaining, was he built this enormous, what looks like an enormous staircase. It's actually a bunch of platforms to display art. But because of the converging lines in perspective, the whole room seems to be getting smaller, and the staircase seems to be very large. And it reminds me of Michelangelo's staircase at the Laurentian Library anteroom, where the staircase sort of flows down and fills the space and sort of presses its presence against the volume. Let me see if I can... I was looking for another quote, can't find it, but take a look at Michelangelo's Laurentian Library staircase, and I think you'll see, again, this kind of mannerist tendency to distort proportion and to create pressures between one volume and another one. Now, we've been talking for some time about how the Japanese tended to borrow from foreign cultures and then close their doors and digest things and then make them their own. I think what's been happening in the last decade, at least, is that the Japanese architects have, in fact, begun to set their own standard. And they're doing work that is no longer mere imitation of the West, but is, in fact, equal to anything that we're producing. And I just want to show a couple of quick comparisons. These are two drawings, both done in the buildings were designed in 1970. This you recognize as Isozaki's Gunma Museum, and this you recognize as Richard Meyer's Bronx Development Center. And a couple of details from each building. Meyer's work is a little bit more based on Corbusier's idea of the maison domino, which has a structure inside and a skin wrapping around it. I think in Isozaki's case, the structure is more like a parson's table. It's more on the outside. But he still uses the idea of the metal as a skin. You can peel away a piece and show what's behind it, just a concrete slab. Isozaki has stuck to this very rigid, somewhat rigid idea of cubes. He's bent this one at an angle, he's pulled it out, he's using the reflective pond. Meyer, on the other hand, has gone to a little bit more expressive use of the material. He's got some semicircular forms interpenetrating with the rectangular forms. But for me, both of these buildings were designed independently in early 70s. I think Isozaki's was finished in 75, and then Meyer's was finished in 77. But I think it indicates that the Japanese are now stepping with, and in some cases stepping ahead of, things that are happening in the West. These are the last two examples of some recent work by Arata Isozaki, where he's starting to deal with these extruded serpentine forms. It's going to be a whole different avenue of investigation for him after the cubes and the grids. Another architect who's doing kind of expressive things, I think, which are equal to anything that are going on anywhere in the world, is Minoru Takayama. He also spent some time in the western part of the world. After graduating from Japan Architecture School, he got a master's at Harvard on a Fulbright, and then, the dean would be interested to know, went to work in Denmark, and along with Henning Larsen, came in second in the Berlin Free University competition. And so Takayama almost got to spend a lot of time in Europe, but he returned to Japan and started doing these expressionist kind of buildings. This building is on the cover of Charles Janck's book, Postmodern, The Language of Postmodern Architecture. It's interesting because since this picture was taken, the building has been completely repainted in a different style. And it tends to represent, I think, the epitome of assemblage, making something out of very little. I mean, it's inexpensive parts, using paint, using catalog components right out of Sweets, or the Japanese version of Sweets. And the buildings are kind of like large abstract paintings. And in the vein of large abstract paintings, they are named Ichiban Kan, building number 1, Niban Kan, building number 2. Now, I said the Japanese were not the least bit shy about borrowing. In fact, they're even a little bit shy about being too innovative. Now, what looks to be kind of an early sketch model for a completed building, this is in fact a completed building by the architect we've been discussing, Minoru Takeyama, and it's a Pepsi-Cola canning plant in Hokkaido. This building on the right, which has the same truncated, extruded circular plant, is actually the Roche-Dinkeloo proposal for an arboretum in Washington, D.C. And I asked Takeyama about, gee, you know, this thing over here looks a lot like this thing over here. And he agreed. He said, I admit it, this is a very good proposal. I saw it in a magazine, and I decided if they weren't going to build it, I was. And you get a sense of what it's like on the inside. It's a great, huge space, and beyond the public space is a whole series of conveyor belts with little cans of Pepsi-Cola running around. Since then, Takeyama has been developing some housing prototypes based on, well, I like these more than some of the others because they're based on the traditional Japanese landscape home. Very, very tight, clustered units on the ground floor with wooden elements that link them on top. And you get a little detail of some of the ideas. These, again, extruded cubic elements over the concrete base. And he hasn't had a chance to build these at full, a whole town, but he did a single family house using this design concept as a prototype. And it's generally, I think, a pretty successful house. Another architect who is sort of pushing and testing the avant-garde edges of technology is an architect named Yutaka Murata, who is the champion of prefab inflatables. This was for Expo 70, and you have to dig out your old Japan architects to see it in plan. It's a perfect circle in plan. 16 tubes, all inflated, and a very spectacular space inside with theaters and projections on the ceiling. And then at the end of the expo, I have another view of it. This is another building, a smaller version, also by Murata. They simply pull a plug, and the whole thing just sort of drifts into a little pile, never to be seen again. I think there's more things that can be done with inflatables and haven't been. And Murata's been doing some studies for these. This is his new polyclimate pavilion. And what he's trying to do is make a cluster of 4 units. On one side, it's very warm. See, swimming pool. On the other side, it's cold, it's ice. And the concept is that these domes are actually double shells, like thermopane glass with a space of air in between. And then they have the, on the back of your car windows, the electric defogger units, little strips of wire, so that when it snows, everything will melt. And the Soviet Union was very impressed with Murata when he developed the Expo stuff, and they asked him to design some things for the Siberian section of the Soviet Union. The reason being they have a very short construction period of only about 3 months when it's not snowing. And so this is a really large, 1 kilometer long park, about 6/10 of a mile. And it has, tennis courts, volleyball courts, basketball courts, has a bicycling area, it has a maze where you can go in and get lost for a few days. And what looked like a column grid, you see these things look like columns normally to hold up the roof, they're really downspouts to hold down the roof, so that when it snows or when it rains, the water would flow through this grid and go into underground receptacles. Now, Murata hasn't been able to build any of his large computer-controlled entertainment palaces, but some others have been built in Japan. This is called Summerland. It's outside Tokyo. And this water, they have machines that can turn on and churn up waves so you can go surfing, like you're actually out there in the water, and all the exposed ductwork. I forget the volume it encloses, but it's like a huge computer-controlled city. Another example of something like that, this is the Naga Shima Onsen Tropical Garden. It's a place where there's a hot spring, and this is all fiberglass on steel struts. It's a little bit like Crystal Palace, 1851, only in a plexiglass version. And inside, it's a big, huge entertainment and museum. They recreate various kinds of microclimates, the desert or the tropics, and they have a zoo with animals and monkeys, and it's a whole enclosed city. What they're edging towards in various ways is elements of building those megastructures that you saw at the beginning of the slideshow. Now, this whole site here is an expo that I think most of us missed. It was called Expo 75, I think. It was in Okinawa when the Japanese got Okinawa back from the Americans finally after the war. They wanted to do something to say, hey, this is our property. And so it's an island way off the coast, and they did this sea park. And Kikutaki, the guy who did those floating houses in Tokyo Bay, designed this floating city. It's called Aquapolis, and that's what Bugs Bunny would call it. But let's see. It occupies 2.5 acres and contains its own energy source, its own desalinization apparatus and sewage disposal system. And these things can fill up with water during typhoons, and it really gives the thing some stability. I think it's clear that the notion of a city floating on water is probably, what shall I say? The aesthetic probably owes more to the offshore oil drilling rigs than it owes to the metabolist structures of the early 60s. One of the last things I wanted to look at was Japanese use of light. Tom Wolfe wrote an article some years ago in the English magazine Architectural Design, AD. He coined the phrase electrographic architecture. And I think there are various ways that electrographic architecture is being used in Japan, some of which is random, street lights, and other of it is more planned. These are, can you focus the one on the left, please? These are cornices on the tops of industrial buildings in the Ginza. And you can't quite tell whether the arrows are going up or going down. The thing is continuously changing. It's a continuously changing light show in the heart of the city. Another example, NEC stands for Nippon Electric Company. Nippon meaning Japan and Japanese, here it is, Nippon Electric. And this cornice, it's like a kinetic cornice continuously changing in the landscape. This is the Sony Building, where Sony displays its many products. And as I was telling some students earlier, there are little restaurants going all the way up along one side. But this facade is designed to continuously change. And you see these little rectangles? Nope, they're not lights. They're little TV screens. I think that's great. And this becomes a symbol in the city. Here's an example of a building that has certain kind of symbolic stature during the day and a very, very clear symbolic stature during the night. And I was looking through, in the 60s, David Crane, who was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, said that urban design should be a giant message system or symbolic intelligence apparatus. And I think you need landmarks in the city, the kinds of things that Kevin Lynch talks about. You need nodes, you need landmarks, you need things people can identify with. And I think it's possible to use electrographic architecture as a kind of symbolic intelligence. See, this guy designed his very, elegant, exposed steel building, and then they came along and they put all this stuff on top of it. And you can see that both during the night and during the day, these neon lights and these bumps and these ribs and all of these things really dominate the facade. And well, maybe he didn't know it was coming, but I think if he knew what kind of corner he was on, to take these kinds of elements and to integrate them with your architecture, I think can enrich the kinds of things that we're doing, rather than doing a building, doing your detailed elevation and getting the proportion right and everything, and then have someone else come along and glue it on top. Now, in closing, I just want to give you a feel for the kinds of things that I think Japan is today and the kinds of things that it's aiming towards. It's really a nation of complexity and contradiction. It's what I call the both-and culture. This is a traditional, ancient Japanese, she's an actress, of course, symbolizing a traditional Japanese geisha. These are very contemporary girls in a park near where I used to live, and they're eating, these are French hot dogs. They're sort of batter-dipped hot dogs. And they're combining the traditional kimono with a kind of polyester fur stole, or whatever that is. And the two things, it's possible for them to coexist. This is 10,000 lanterns of the Kasuga Shrine, which coexist quite comfortably with the 10,000 lanterns of downtown Tokyo. The traditional sake kegs, wrapped in straw for the new year, coexist in Japan quite comfortably with the prefab plastic crates, which stack up to hold the Japanese beer. The traditional black, white, red lanterns symbolizing the store coexist with our little importation from America, Mac fried potato, 70 yen. My favorite guys, the Deva Kings, who guard the Horyuji Temple against evil spirits, coexist with the guardians of the shopping centers in contemporary Japanese architecture. And amid, the plug-in capsules, the prefab FRP fiber reinforced plastic modules, still in the cities of Tokyo, you get the soft, colorful banners. This one commemorating the Kabuki Theater and telling you what's going to be on the show this afternoon. These are banners telling you what's going to be today's sumo tournament, who's playing against whom, and the soft textures of the traditional Japanese carp, the koinobari, swimming upstream, with a little symbol of the 20th century there, mixing with the traditional Japanese tile roofs and the contemporary reinforced concrete. They both coexist simultaneously. And again, the softness and the delicacy of traditional Japanese sensitivity to natural materials can be used today with modern electricity, as Isamu Noguchi has shown here in his examples of modern Japanese lanterns. And I think as we look at Japan and as we try to analyze where it's going and as it zooms into the future, I myself, and I hope all of you, will wait with wonder to see what creative things come forward from this land of the rising sun. Thank you.
Since we went over.
Oh, we went over. We'll take a break.
We'll meet outside if any of you have any questions. And it took a guy from New York who works in California to go to Japan, to come to Indiana, to tell me that a corn dog